Now we want to discuss the 5 elements of style. These 5 elements are correctness, lucidity or clarity, language or appropriateness, ornament, and sentence structure. We start with correctness. And the rule for correctness is essentially speak standard English. Correctness has to do with your grammar and your choice of words. Now, a couple of these are going to deal with grammar, so we'll talk about the different ways. But here, under correctness, we want to say that for the most part, you need to speak standard English with only deliberate departures, no accidental lapses. I know that when you're a college student and you're learning a lot of big words and so on, you want to be careful to minimize how many of those you use. It is good and okay to use big and even unfamiliar words. William Safire, in his book Lend Me Your Ears, which is just a collection of articles he wrote on language. He had a regular article that he wrote as a syndicated columnist called On Language that he wrote for the New York Times for many years. And he argues there that you don't want to use unfamiliar words, but you do. And it's good because, especially if your audience is curious and wants to look it up and find out, that's a way to gain interest. But when we're considering correctness, we want to say that you want to use standard English. Sharon Crowley, in her book on Rhetoric, said sometimes sometimes correctness is translated as purity. Correctness means that readers should use words that were current and should adhere to the grammatical rules of whatever language they wrote. So this, again, includes words that are current and proper English as well. This means that you need to pay attention to things like spelling and punctuation in written discourse. It is a distraction and an annoyance to people when you misspell words. So when you check your spelling, you're not just checking it for the sake of your grade. It is a way of loving your neighbor. It's like fingernails on a chalkboard. To read bad grammar and improper spelling. And for most people, even people who don't spell well, to encounter a misspelled word will be an irritation. It also means that you need to pay attention to things like split infinitives, dangling participles, and ending sentences with prepositions. Churchill once said that that's the sort of thing up with which we shall not put. The second element of style is lucidity or clarity. Now, lucidity would be one of those unfamiliar words, so we use clarity as the standard way of saying it. But to say lucidity is a good thing because it makes you think, what is lucidity? Well, it speaks of being lucid. And that helps you to understand what the word clarity means and what we mean by clarity. Sharon Crowley said that lucidity, she points out, comes from the Latin word lucere, which means to shine. If something is lucent or translucent, it means that you can see through it. Literally, clarity means that your language lets the meaning shine through it, like light shining through a window. Sharon Crowley again had this to say: clarity simply means that readers should use words in their ordinary or usual everyday senses, unless they had some compelling reason to do otherwise. Now, Sharon Crowley points out a number of ways that clarity is obscured. And we need to consider that. There are times where you want to obscure your meaning, either for the sake of mystery or for the sake of discretion. Sometimes discretion keeps you from being too clear about what was going on. One way that clarity is obscured is by obsolete, technical, new, or colloquial words. All right, so when you use obscure words or obscure language, you're using words that are no longer in popular use. He motored down the road. That's not the way we would usually say it. But you can see that saying that he motored to the next town gives a little bit of a flair, a little touch. It can make your writing more interesting. So again, the rule, these are not hard and fast rules. These are not thou shalt nots. This is not the Ten Commandments etched with the finger of God on stone tablets. These are general rules that generally ought to be followed, but there are times where you can deviate from these rules. Technical language, also known as jargon. Jargon would be the technical word for technical language, are words used by specialists in a profession or a discipline. For instance, what you might encounter in a theology class, soteriology, pneumatology, hamartiology. Those kinds of terms are technical terms, and you want to be careful about using them. When you use them, it is okay to use them, but you need to make sure that your audience has the ability to find out what you're saying, what you're referring to. Pedagogy, teachers will use. Well, if you're hearing a teacher speak of, or you're in a class and the teacher starts speaking about pedagogy, and you have no idea what that teacher's speaking about, and you don't have the ability to look up the word, you don't have a dictionary there, or it would be rude to look it up, or look it up on your phone or your laptop or something while they're speaking, it would be important or necessary for the teacher, the speaker, to give some clue, some hint or indication of what pedagogy is speaking of. The same thing, I think, well, let me say it this way. In written discourse, you have a little bit more liberty with these things. You are able to use words that are not as familiar because your audience has the power to look it up. And if they're curious about what you're saying, they will go look it up. If they're trying to figure it out, like this looks important, I better figure out what he means by this. All right? Quintilian warned against the practice of coining new words. Neologism is the word he used for it, which is interesting because he coined a new word to describe coining new words. So that's kind of a technical term as well. Neologism. Neo, new. Logism comes from logos, the word. And there you have it. But he uses that technical language to warn against obscuring meaning with words that are unknown or unfamiliar. Now, it is interesting how many times the Apostle Paul coined a new term in his epistles and writings and so on. So there is a place for it. Somebody somewhere coined the term Googled. He Googled her. And technology has introduced a lot of new words to our vocabulary. So there's a place for it, but you need to be careful about it. And the biggest thing is that new words are not familiar to those who hear or read them. So if you're going to coin a new term, you want to make sure that it's a term that your audience can figure out what you mean by it. All right, how about this one? Colloquial words. I used that earlier. Colloquial also is somewhat technical, somewhat obscure. Colloquial words are used in a very specific locale or culture. In the South, for instance, they have certain ways that they say things. Eat your greens, things like that. Where I grew up, if you asked somebody if they wanted to have a carbonated beverage, you would either say, do you want a pop? Or you would say, do you want a Coke? Where I grew up, you'd say, do you want a Coke? And someone would say, sure, and then you'd say, what kind? Because Coke became synonymous with pop. So that's colloquial. We use colloquial words most frequently when we're speaking of something that we think is really neat or really great. We say cool, or we say awesome. In olden days, they might say hip, or that's really square. Or I think in the 70s, they would say that's rad. You probably say that now. We have all kinds of terms, and I'm not really up on what the newest way of saying it is. Oh man, I hear people say it when we're out candy selling. That's when I'm usually reintroduced to the cultural languages. Quintilian's rule for clarity, which was quoted by Crowley, is that the best course is to call things by the names people ordinarily use, unless for some reason the name would puzzle an audience or give offense. In other words, readers should always use language that is familiar to their audiences, even if this language is colloquial or jargon-laden. There, how about that for breaking the rules? Under clarity, you also want to avoid euphemisms. Now, euphemism, there's another technical term. But since we are studying rhetoric, and that is a technical study, technical course of study, we will use more technical language. Euphemisms, also known as weasel words, are words or terminology that is used really to veil the meaning. It's what somebody says when they don't want to come right out and say it. You need to avoid euphemism, the passive voice, and, as the Wilsons said it, bloviation. William Safire used the example of euphemism, the example of the U.S. Embassy in Budapest, which warned every diplomat that it must be assumed that available casual indigenous female companions work for or cooperate with the Hungarian government security establishment. That's euphemism. What the U.S. Embassy in Budapest is trying to say, as William Safire points out, is that the local whores are spies. But the purpose of euphemism is, again, sometimes to be discreet in what you're saying. Safire said, "Welcome to the world of euphemism, where the national flower is a fig leaf, and the refusal to use painful words has not passed away." Now, it is the first duty of a speaker to be clear. And if you think about it, it is a colossal waste of time to put all the time and effort required for writing and delivering a piece of discourse in either spoken or written form, if your audience has no idea what in the world you were saying when you're finished. So, again, quoting the Wilsons, it is the first duty of a speaker to be clear and to be able to stop talking before being interrupted. Now, Wilson, in his lesson on style, refers to the great enemy of style, which he says is every form of humbug, presumption, and posing. As college students, you are being inundated with new and fascinating knowledge. And a lot of it is impressive to you. Avoid the mistake of trying to be impressive with what you know, trying to impress people with what you know. Listen, if you have to impress people with what you know, first of all, it means you don't know it very well. Because if you know it well, you don't need to impress anybody with it. People are impressed with what you know already. Earlier on the same page, Wilson points out the sophistry of using terminology designed to, as he says it, impress the non-initiates. There are times when you should not be clear. For the sake of discretion, for example. The word for this is circumlocution, which literally means speaking around. Circum, there's that circle, and locution speaks of speaking, so talking around the subject. Quintilian suggests using circumlocution when referring to obscenities, unseemly behavior, or trivial matters. You would want to use circumlocution, for example, when referring to the story of David and Bathsheba. And some of what the prophets of the Old Testament had to say about the daughters of Israel and their quest for Egyptian men, for example, is something that our King James Bible uses circumlocution. Does not translate as plainly as it could for the sake of discretion. The Song of Solomon is another example of that. A poetic rendering of a very intimate relationship, husband and wife relationship. There's a place for it. That's what we're trying to say. There is a place for it. So, you want to be clear. That's the first thing. There are some things that can be used to veil a little bit. Look, you put blinds in your windows, and you put them there for a reason. There's a time to open the blinds, and there's a time to shut the blinds, where you don't want the world to see what's going on. And my neighbor, I always know what my neighbor's doing because he doesn't put any window covering in his house, and so I can even see what he's watching on TV. There's a time to cover it. Even tinting the windows sometimes, so people can see inside, but they see through a glass darkly. What you don't want to do, and again, a mistake that we talked about, is where you're trying to impress people. Beware of that. The third element of style is appropriateness, which can be paired with language style. We'll discuss that next. We'll separate them and then bring them back together. Appropriateness. Crowley defines it as to say or do whatever is fitting in a given situation. Now the key here is in a given situation. Gorgias taught the idea of kairos, seizing the right moment to speak. The moment when listeners are ready to hear. Now, that's where the 6 parts of discourse come into play, and using your introduction and your statement of facts in order to bring your audience to the place where they're ready to hear your arguments. Really, however long your introduction and your statement of facts are, it is preparation for that. Now, that being said, there's a larger sense of this kairos, which is using appropriate language and language style in order to bring your audience also to that place where they're ready to hear what you have to say. Now, we talked about it I think in the last lecture when we talked about the grand, middle, and plain style, and that really, this appropriateness has a lot to do with that. And again, I would remind you as a young person, you need to be conscious of who you are. But it's not just that. When you're considering which style to use, you need to consider the issue, the audience, the setting for that audience, and yourself. All of those things factor into which style you will use. Every occasion for writing or speaking differs from the next. And so you have to put in all of those things. Look, don't use the grand style in your 1st and 2nd grade junior church. There's no place for it at all. Unless in the middle of your story, you're delivering a speech that's part of your story, you can throw it in there. So a brief digression, if you will. But, and that's where you have to be familiar. You have to think about all three. Who are you? What are you trying to say? What is your issue? And who is your audience? If you've, had a great deal of success soul winning at the trailer park, and you've got a class full of people and you're about to do a Bible study with them, even the middle style is probably a little too much for them. Even if your subject matter is really important and calls for a grand style, you don't want to use that at that time. So, language style. We're speaking of the three levels, grand, middle, and plain. We already discussed. To accomplish this, you must know, as I said, you must know your audience first, your issue second, and yourself first. The grand style might appeal more to a particular audience, or the issue might call for it, or it could fit with your personality. But the grand style might not be appropriate for who you are. Or your audience might have very little patience for such things, or even consider it pompous and pretentious. In most cases, especially in our day when we don't really value eloquence and oratorical skill the way we once did, the middle style will most of the time be most appropriate. If you're young, as I said, you should avoid too much of the plain style. It shows a lack of respect for your audience and a lack of respect for your issue as well. And in a sense, as I said, you'll come across as immature. So essentially what I'm arguing here is that you need to be aware of the protocol. What does the situation, what does the issue call for? What is appropriate here? Sharon Crowley said the plain style is appropriate when clarity is the main goal dictated by the occasion, while the middle style is appropriate for almost any discourse that will be published. Keep that in mind. All right, ornament is something we'll come back to. I would just say in advance that ornament does not involve, it's not like you're decorating a Christmas tree. You set up the tree, then you go back and hang the lights, and then you go back and put on the ornaments. That's not how you want to do this. You don't want to go back through your speech and add some adjectives. As the Wilson said, the eggs of ornament need to be put into the cake mix early on. Sorry I slaughtered that. The last is sentence structure, and essentially on the subject of sentence structure, it makes a difference what style you're using. So in a grand style, you'll use bigger, more elaborate, more complex sentences. In a middle or plain style, you'll use shorter sentences. Now there is a place for short, almost staccato, punchy, simple sentences right in a row. And it will have, using that kind of sentence structure, will have a rhetorical impact on your audience, as will longer, more complex sentences. So you need to pay attention to the length and style and complexity of your sentence as well. When we come back, then we will deal with ornament directly.